Welcome, everybody, to another RT Talks. I am Matt, and I'm here today joined by Tom to talk to you about all things related to being an independent tabletop RPG creator. And, at the end of the day, that's what we're all part of this community for, right? We're all striving to grow as TTRPG content creators, grow our business, grow our reach in our communities. So I'm hoping today, Tom, we can talk about that. And I'm incredibly humbled to be joined by you here today. You're one of the leading creators in the space for map making and battle map assets. So it's really awesome to be talking to you. Your breathtaking battle maps can be found pretty much in every VTT out there, Foundry, Roll20, Alchemy RPG. And your physical battle map book is so cool. One day, I'm sure it'll find its way onto my gaming table because being able to physically manipulate is key for me when I'm playing games.
Oh, come and see me at convention. I'll hold one for you.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that, Tom. So Tom Cartos, welcome.
Thank you
to our interview today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. I'm just here talking. DeMille is the one who did all of the hard stuff, which is scheduling and outreach and all that.
Sure. Thank you, DeMille.
Before we get going, did you want to say hello to folks? Maybe let them know a little bit more about who you are and where they can find you before we get started.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Tom. I make battle maps primarily and a bunch of stuff associated with battle maps for TTRPGs. Been doing it for about 4.5 years now, I think. Primarily through Patreon, but I'm also on other places, as Matt mentioned, like Roll20 and Foundry. And I've started making physical products very recently. My background is in architecture, and I only really got into TTRPGs about 6 months before I became a creator.
Awesome. Cool. So yeah, I'm really eager to talk to you about everything that has to do with being an independent creator, the things that you've found success in, or the things that you've had trouble overcoming. So, and like I said, most of the folks here in this community, we're striving to grow our TTRPG businesses to a size where we can work on it full time, or if we already are, to grow it even further. So I'm super excited to talk to you about your perspectives and kind of the things that have worked for you and the things that you might have advice or recommendations for us. I've tried to organize our chat into 3 groups. So for those of us listening here today, there's kind of 3 categories that I'm hoping to touch on. One is like social media and community. The other is overcoming obstacles. And the last is kind of this balance between freelance work versus the things that you do for yourself as a creator. Does that make sense, Tom? All sounds good?
All sounds good to me.
Beauty. All right. So everybody listening, hope the conversation's interesting for you. If at any time you have questions about some of the stuff that we're talking about, or you have more pointed, specific things that you want us to address, please put those questions in the RT Discussions text chat. You're welcome to stay here in the chat here to hype me and Tom up, send gifts, reactions, and get us excited and full of energy. But the questions specifically for Tom, if you don't mind putting them into the RT Discussions text chat, it'll remind me to go find them at the end of the discussion today. So yeah, let's get right into it. Let's start talking about social media and community. Why don't I pass a nice softball first? What kind of social media platforms do you like to use, Tom, and why?
So I'm primarily, really on Discord, which I think counts the social media platform.
Yeah, I think at this point, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of like promoting myself, Reddit, Pinterest, and Twitter are the ones I mainly focus on. I'm also on Instagram, but I don't really go there very often. At this point, I have a social media manager who does a lot of that stuff for me.
Nice.
Which I would recommend to anyone if you reach a point where you can. Very, very helpful.
Yeah, because it's always tricky kind of learning the ins and outs of like the algorithms and when to post and how often to post and all that.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, so having somebody who knows that's great. That's awesome advice. Are there platforms that you've found a lot of success in, especially now that you have your manager doing it? Are there certain platforms that you feel like they're using more often than others, and for what kind of thing?
I have found more success primarily through Reddit and Pinterest than any of the others. I think a lot of people assume that a big following on platforms like Twitter or Instagram or TikTok converts well. But really, anything that has good SEO in Google, which means Reddit and Pinterest, is going to show up a whole lot more.
Mhm.
So Pinterest is really the one I try to recommend to people a lot that I don't think a lot of people kind of are aware is useful or are using, especially if you are a visual creator. It doesn't suffer from what many of the other platforms suffer from, which is decay over time. So it doesn't matter how old your post is, if it's relevant to a search, it will show up.
That's super good advice. Yeah, I same thing with Reddit even.
Yes,
I hadn't considered it for that same reason, but
exactly.
when you get a lot of upvotes on Reddit, it'll be something that people will search for a long time.
Yeah.
That's fantastic advice. As far as building communities go, though, Tom, I can't help but notice that, like you're saying, a lot of these times, these numbers on X or TikTok or whatever, they don't tend to convert really into an active and engaged community. So I'd be curious to know what you recommend to people listening who are trying to build this community of supporters and people who consume our products. How would you recommend going about that? What kind of ways have you found being able to convert from social media and clicks into a community?
I think community in general is it's an interesting idea and something that people maybe think about too much.
Hmm.
It's definitely important to engage with and kind of try to connect with the people who enjoy your work, like whether they be fans or subscribers or customers. But for me, community is particularly, I think, in the TTRPG industry has always been more about connecting with peers and other creators. And I found you get so much more from that. I think the idea of kind of fans as community comes a lot more from kind of streaming platforms like Twitch and YouTube, where people are watching you do stuff live and they're talking to you about it through the process. And I've never felt that that's necessarily something you should focus on. It's something that will happen over time. As you grow, you'll get more fans, and a particular percentage of those fans will want a closer connection with you. And so long as you have platforms where they can reach out, Discord's a good one, then I think that's enough. I think aiming to grow a community around you based on a product is maybe not the right focus. It makes more sense in spaces like this Discord in particular. This is what I would consider a community, and you're going to get so much more from a place like this than you would from trying to reply to every message that someone who's bought one of your products sends you.
Yeah, that's really insightful actually, and I hadn't really considered it that way. So I appreciate you saying that because it's totally right. Like communities like this one of peer-driven support communities definitely have helped me grow, and I think that distinction is an important one, right? The fans versus the peers. So I appreciate you saying that. As far as finding communities like this, I imagine people that are listening right now have already found us. Do you feel like outside of reaching out to other people in the public or other creators, is there another way to build a community that you're aware of, or is this really just find people that are like-minded and stick with it?
I think the latter is really what community is. I think also there's obviously a big focus on connecting online, which is the easiest way to do it, and you can connect with people internationally. But it's also helps so much to try and meet people in person. So obviously not everyone can go to the big conventions like PAX and Gen Con, but even if you have local conventions and you want to go down to and just get to know people, maybe get a table showing your product, whether you think you're going to make money from it, it's a really, really good way to meet people. And you do get, I think, a stronger connection in person. So a lot of the kind of the communities I've become a part of were people I initially met online, and that's where the community started. But I feel like they progressed so much more when we actually got to meet in person, and so much more has kind of come from those connections. So that's something I'd recommend whenever you can. Obviously, you've got to be careful with health, with things like COVID. Not everyone can go out, but if you have an opportunity, I would definitely recommend it.
Yeah, same thing goes for like the small conventions, right? Like you're not going to meet maybe the big industry experts there, but you might be surprised by the amount of local talent that you have in your community.
100%, yeah.
Yeah.
I've done a few local conventions, one-day conventions, and you get kind of lulls during the day where you got waves of people coming, and it's such a good opportunity to just talk to people in the booths around you, get to know what they're doing, what their background is, how they're building. And it's such a good way to kind of make connections and network.
Yeah, totally. And Tom, this is a question that we didn't get a chance to think of ahead of time, but I'd be curious to know at conventions, for those people listening who might feel, anxiety or stress when it comes to meeting new people, talking about your business, what kind of advice might you give to people like that who want to do it, but also feel that social anxiety and pressure that might come with going to something like
Uh, I think one of the big things to remember is that 90% of the people there also feel that way.
that?
You're not the only one. It can very easily feel like that when you're in your own head, like everyone else knows what they're doing and they're confident and they're outgoing. They're not. They all have the same anxieties and hang-ups as you do, and they probably want to come and talk to you just as much as you want to go and talk to them. This isn't an industry with people with big egos. In my experience, the vast majority of people are just wonderful and welcoming and eager to kind of help out and give advice and make those connections.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Absolutely. And I like to think of us all as just a big group of nerds, right? We're just all a bunch of geeks and
Yeah,
nerds who love games
that's it. Yeah.
in the best way possible, of course.
Yeah. We've all got something in common to talk about.
Yeah, totally. Awesome, awesome. So I think that covers most of what I wanted to talk about as far as community and social media goes.
Sure.
Now let's maybe jump into obstacles and overcoming those obstacles. And I think as an independent creator, we have our fair share of things that we have to overcome. And maybe I'd like to ask you really quickly, Tom, what are some of the everyday challenges that, when you think of things that you have to kind of grind through or get done, what are some of those everyday challenges that you've encountered and how have you found a way to overcome them?
I think one of the biggest challenges, particularly as an independent creator, is actually not having someone telling you what to do. It's figuring out how should I be spending my time, where should I be focusing, what should I be doing day to day. And the reality is the only way you can figure that out is by trying stuff. Early on, it's a case of try a lot of things, always be cautious of burnout, but have a look in lots of different directions. But very quickly, as soon as one of them starts to take the lead, focus in on that one. Other than that, I'd say just over time, I've got very good at kind of building out my own schedule and workflow. So I think it's a challenge that I struggle with less now, but there's still always the issue of far too many ideas. Which one do I pick and which one do I work on today?
Yeah, that's a challenge for sure. Just balancing it all out. It can be tricky. It can be hard to hear too. Like sometimes your gut goes one direction and it's not the right way. So that's happened to me.
Yeah. If you've always been in a job where you've had, people above you in the hierarchy and you sit down at the start of the day and they tell you what you're doing that day, switching from that to just suddenly having full control is liberating, but it can also be very scary.
Hmm. Hmm. The beauty and shackles of complete freedom.
Yeah.
Those are sure are things that everybody listening has had to be faced with. One thing too, we touched a little bit about it already, Tom, is just how supportive this community is. The tabletop RPG creator community is probably the most supportive community I've been a part of.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't say I've been in that many, but definitely this desire to help each other and collaborate and support one another is very strong in this space. But despite that, I still feel like there is a limited amount of consumers that we're all trying to get to together, grow the market base as big as we can. And it can still be an obstacle for content creators, especially as they get started in this space. I'd be curious to know what kind of advice you might have for somebody listening who maybe hasn't found their audience yet. How can you find people that want to consume your product or buy your book or read your adventure, as the community grows and as digital tools become more and more available to people? How do you stand out?
It's a big question. There's a lot of potential answers. I'll kind of focus on potentially earlier on when you're still figuring out exactly what it is you want to do and how to find that initial audience rather than how to grow it. Certainly collaboration is a good way to do it. In my experience, collaboration, doing projects together, kind of crossing over between two audiences works really well early on. You see much better impact and engagement from it with two smaller creators working together than potentially two larger creators. So I would recommend trying to get into collaborations, group collaborations, if you're starting out, and that is a good way to kind of be seen by more people, particularly the kind of people who like supporting newer creators. Because it's a different audience in and of itself. Some people will only be interested once you've already kind of reached a certain level and I think, okay, they're big enough that I'm going to buy in. Whereas other people really want to support newcomers. In terms of finding your own niche, I think a lot of people assume you have to scour the market and figure out what's not being done. And I don't think that's the case. I think that's actually kind of impossible. What you need to do is figure out what your own strengths are and how you can create something that builds on those strengths and does so in a different way to what's already being done. So this can kind of sound like two different things, but I think it's a different way to consider how you're approaching the problem. There will be probably a feeling that I can just see what other people have done that's made them popular or successful and just follow that. That very rarely works, especially in a small industry. People will just look at you and think you're a copycat. So it's seeing what's being done and how can I do this in my way. And I think that's the best way to kind of find your niche market and make sure you're going to actually enjoy what you're doing and not just try and chase something you think might make money, but is ultimately just going to lead you to burnout.
That's really well said. I have to echo that, right? Like, if this is going to be what you're going to be doing day in and day out, you need to be passionate about it. Yeah. I think everybody here is definitely passionate about games and role playing and stuff like this, but it's got to be something that you're going to enjoy the bulk of, right? If you don't like making maps, don't make maps. Or if you don't like podcasting.
Yeah. There's always going to be some part of the job that you don't like doing or it's not your favorite part. But if you're not enjoying the core of what you're creating, then it's never going to go anywhere.
Yeah. And Domil talking about, coming from a space of graphic design, that's definitely, take the space that you're coming from, take the skills that you've developed there and try to implement it into what you do in the TTRPG space. Definitely good advice there.
Yeah.
Awesome. Speaking of earlier on, Tom, you mentioned how it can be hard to manage your time, how it can be hard to kind of figure out what to do when. I'd be curious to know what kind of strategies you've employed, because you're obviously juggling a lot of hats when you're an independent creator, because for the most part, it's a team of one until you grow big enough to be a bigger team than that. So I'd be curious to know your advice.
Yeah. I mean, even at this point, I'm the only full-time person working on Tom Cartos. I'm very fortunate that I have a lot of freelancers and contractors working with me, but I do all the admin, I do all the finance, I do all the project management as well as drawing. Only about half of my job now is making stuff, which, that kind of leads into the idea of scheduling. Whereas when I started out, my schedule was very simple. Each month I released 4 different maps, so each one took a week. So I'd just sit down on a Monday, I'd work till Friday, I'd post it on Saturday. That was quite simple, and I'd suggest trying to stick to a schedule like that early on. Just figure out what your workflow is, what your deadlines are, and just do, if it takes one day to make something or a week, have a deadline at the start and stick to it. Now, essentially on the first day of each month, I sit down and I plan out a calendar of what needs to be done that month, approximately how long I think each of those things is going to take me, and then day by day write out what task needs to be done each day. That was something I've had to do more and more now that, as you say, I'm juggling lots of plates rather than just make something, post it, put it on social media, make something, post it, put it on social media. So it does depend a little bit on how much stuff you've got going on and how different they all are. But I think having a tool, even I literally just use Notepad, like the basic Notepad that comes on Mac. And that's how I do it. You don't need to use like Trello or something fancy like that. In fact, I tried those for a while and I find they're just a good way to procrastinate. So having a simple schedule is a good way to do it. And especially with something like Patreon that works on a monthly basis where you have to get everything out by the end of the month, you've got a hard deadline. It's not a project where you're writing and maybe it takes you 6 months or 9 months or a year. It can kind of slide. It's good to have that hard deadline. It can really help.
Yeah, totally. And I do want to, this is maybe a good opportunity to plug something that this community does quite well. If you're having a hard time, listener, to keep yourself on top of your routine and your schedule, we have 3 different meetings. They're all the same. They're called the goals meetings, but we have 3 of them throughout the week here in the TTRPG Rising Tide community, where you can hopefully, talk about your goals, and the others will help keep you accountable to meeting them. So they can be things like scheduling and whatnot, but definitely worth checking out. But yeah. I agree, Tom, having hard deadlines, someone's got to do it. And if it's just a team of one, it's going to be you. Yes.
Yeah. Having people hold you accountable is also a really good way of doing it. Saying out loud, even if it's not people you know, just saying online, I'm going to finish this by X day,
Mm.
makes you accountable. You put it out there and people are going to hold you to it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Definitely. And I mean, I'm not saying that the goals meetings that people in there are going to be coming after you if you don't meet your objectives, but it's
No, but like you can feel like if you have an idea in your head of when you're meant to finish, it's easy for that to move. As
yeah,
soon as you've said it out loud, it's more real and more definitive.
totally. Awesome, sweet. So I think that covers obstacles. Actually, wait, there's one more that I wanted to talk about.
Mhm.
Criticism.
Yes.
I think in the public space, there's a lot of people that are going to be critical of our work. Sometimes it's constructive, most of the time it's not. And I'm somebody who doesn't have a very thick skin. So when somebody says something mean to me on the internet, which is often enough because the internet is a mean place, and I can't help but take it to heart, even though I know I shouldn't. So I'd be curious to know how you handle unsolicited criticism and, how do you quote unquote grow a thick skin?
Sure. Yeah. I think it's probably important to start this conversation by just pointing out the obvious that I am a white cis man. So I probably receive the least criticism of any group on the internet. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. My experience, particularly with people critiquing your work, is the vast majority of the time, the critique is not about them telling you what you did wrong or wanting to point out what you did wrong. It is them seeing an opportunity to prove how smart they are to strangers online.
Mm.
So it's just so happened that your work was what fell in front of them, and that's just the kind of person they are. So it's not about you. It's a them problem. Let them deal with it. And again, there can sometimes be good criticisms hidden amongst it, but that's so rarely the case that you're better off just ignoring any critique that wasn't asked for.
Mm.
Again, if you are in a position where you can hire anyone to help you, even if it's part-time, social media manager is the first place I'd go. One, because it saves you so much time, but two, because it can act as a screen for those comments. If you don't want to see them, have someone else look at them and just pass on the relevant ones. If you can't afford a social media manager, maybe just getting a friend to do that for you. Have them check any comments on your posts and delete them before you go in there if it's not something you want to see. I think that's probably more important. If you are, a minority on the internet or a woman, you're going to get a lot more hateful critique. And if you can have someone who you trust to go in and check those ahead of time, that can be very helpful. The other thing I like to do is if someone does post a particularly nasty comment, especially if it's on like Reddit or Twitter or somewhere where more comments means more engagement, means the algorithm pushes it, I just say, thank you for helping boost my post.
I love that. I love that. Yeah, yeah. Or disabling notifications like Damila's saying in chat.
Disabling notifications is also very much an option.
Yeah, 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 for sure. Sweet, great. And actually, I lied, Tom. I said we were going to move on after that one, but there's one other one. And I'm not sure exactly how this fits into being an obstacle, but I can't help but think of generative AI and the use of AI tools to come in to our industry and kind of disrupt things. I'm not a big fan of the use of AI tools. In fact, I would say I don't want them anywhere near any of my projects. But I'd love to hear, you as a map maker who does a lot of visual media, I'd love to know how the use of AI has impacted your kind of workflow and your business, and also just to kind of get your position and any insights you might have with regards to AI and in the TTRPG space, especially in the map making space.
Sure. I mean, I think the majority of the TTRPG community are kind of all on the same boat into when it comes to AI. Most people don't want it, will call it out when they see it, will not go for a product when it's obvious. However, over time, it's going to become much harder to know what's AI and what isn't. So although it's something that none of us want to be part of the industry, I think the reality is in some way it will become a part of it. It's hard to know what the impact is personally, but it's obvious there's been impact across the industry and connected industries like gaming and games journalism. We've seen lots of layoffs and leaving. I think a large part of that right now is that AI is just the new shiny buzzword that a lot of C-suite seeing and thinking, I can cut staff and it will save me money. And a year from now, they'll realize, actually, it won't. I need to hire all these people back. So maybe it's me being optimistic, but I don't think it's going to have the huge impact a lot of people feel it will right now. I think there's a lot of silver-tongued salesman in AI pretending it can do a lot more than it can, and it's going to go a lot further than it will. And I think, at least in the near future, we're probably close to the limit of what it's going to be able to do. It might, get slightly more detailed or make slightly less mistakes. But I think it's something people need to be aware of what's going on, but not something you need to have an existential crisis about, which I think can certainly be something you can spiral into if you're doom scrolling about AI online.
Yeah, totally.
So yeah, try to keep abreast of what's happening, particularly in terms of things like lawsuits and copyright, and also how models are evolving. But I think right now is probably where it's going to seem the worst, and over time it's going to get better.
Yeah, that's some words of optimism brought to you by Tom Cartos. That's great. I love that. I think I agree with you there, Tom. It's important for us to stay informed about what it is, right? You can't know the impacts or try to predict them if you don't really understand the systems that are at play. So being aware of what's going on and then putting money where you know that the people that are making creations and content by hand or by a human being is another way to help support and keep us going.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's also something to consider, is that even if AI does become more prolific in products, not using AI means that's just another selling point. There's always going to be a market for people who want handmade things. This is just kind of the digital version of artisanal products.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And maybe that means you can increase your prices.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it for sure. And I think as long as we band together like we have been, we're good. We have a strong defense, as it were.
Definitely.
Awesome. Now let's move on to the last pillar that I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. And it kind of speaks again to this balancing act, right? Your work and freelance work and that kind of thing.
Yes.
Before I move on to the RT discussion questions from folks, which there are quite a few of them. But yeah, so Tom, as far as balancing your work goes, we talked a little bit about our own schedules, but I'd love to know how freelancing kind of comes into this. I know that a lot of people in our community here might have their own projects going on, but then also will be freelancing on some of the projects for bigger industry or bigger companies that are hiring them to write this or design this or that or the other thing.
Yep.
So I'd love to know how freelance came into your career, like how that balance worked out for you, and also kind of get a sense of how do you know when you need to dedicate time to your own independent material, even though it might not be able to financially support you as a creator yet. How you balance that out?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, ultimately, you really need to focus on where the money's coming from. You do need to kind of give the time to what's paying your bills, but you also need to think, how is that going to change over time? So certainly early on, when I started out, I was probably doing more freelance stuff than Patreon, because Patreon was making pennies. And over time, the Patreon grew to the point where I was starting to ease off that, still doing both at the same time. And for then quite a long time, when the Patreon took off, I stopped doing freelance work. So my advice early on is just try lots of things. Try Patreon, try freelance, try working with bigger publishers, try working as a group. But you need to be ready to pivot very quickly. If one of those things clearly starts working, focus on that. If one of them is clearly not working, let it go. And you can't hold on to things too much early on. Mm-hmm. Now I have started taking on freelance work again, but because I'm in the fortunate position where I don't need to rely on it for money, I'm kind of looking at what projects interest me the most. Something potentially controversial to say is that exposure is actually something that needs to be considered. You should never accept only exposure for work you're doing. Always make sure you're getting paid at least a decent amount. But if I'm choosing between projects or choosing what I'm going to charge, I will adjust that based on, is this going to put my work in front of a new audience and potentially lead to more income down the line? So I know it's kind of almost a meme or a cliche to say exposure is not payment. It's not, but it is something you need to take into account.
Yeah.
Especially in this industry where a lot of people are only working part-time and doing freelance. Can you make the two work together? The other thing I do now, and I did early on as well, I think there's only one freelance project I've done, maybe two, where from the outset I didn't negotiate maintaining commercial rights. So everything I've ever made for a commercial project has also gone on my Patreon. So essentially it's both. I've got paid twice for it. And it's a good way to negotiate, especially if you're working with a smaller publisher. They maybe don't have a big budget. If you say, I'll give you a 30, 50% discount on my rates, if you let me also put this on my Patreon or my store or my itch or whatever you've got, they will normally say yes. And then you have an ongoing revenue stream from that.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And it really helps, like you're saying, you're knocking down two birds with one stone, right?
Absolutely. My advice in this industry is try and go for five birds. If you can stream drawing it or writing it, if you can put that on YouTube, if you can put it on your Patreon, if you're getting paid for the commission, if you can put it on a store, those are all different revenue sources for one job.
Yeah, that's great advice. And maybe we can dig in a little bit more there, Tom, as far as diversifying our income streams. I think that that's something that is super critical. And I know that it was something that you wanted to talk a little bit about. As far as that goes, did you have other things to add or recommendations for people listening on how they can explore and why they should explore diversifying their income streams?
Yeah, obviously the first reason to do it is that you can get paid more than once for the same piece of work. The other thing is that although we are independent creators, we are almost always reliant on other platforms to make our money, whether that's Patreon or Ko-fi or DriveThruRPG or the Roll20 Marketplace or anything like that. Even if you are selling on your own store, that's probably not where your primary income comes from. And it's not good to be reliant on a single one of those platforms because we never know when one of them is just going to disappear or something's just going to happen to cause that revenue stream to go away. So it's a case of don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I think that's something that's really important that people should consider. It can feel scary because it means like that's more work on top of what I'm already doing. But again, it's something that I now pay someone to upload that stuff for me because I'm in a position I can do that. But early on, I had an arrangement where I would just pay them a percentage of every sale. And those sales were high enough that they were happy with that. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an upfront payment. If you can, split the profits 50-50 with someone who does the work of the uploading to all the different marketplaces, that's still an extra revenue stream for you and them.
It's a really cool way to do the revenue split too. I've heard of, co-authors or having an artist and a project manager, but having somebody who's responsible for the uploads is equally important.
Yeah.
Because that's where it's going to get sold.
There are creators and also companies now that kind of specialize in converting your adventures for Roll20 or for Foundry or for Alchemy and things like that. So I'd look into them as well. Their rates tend to be very reasonable.
Yeah, super cool advice. Last but not least, as far as freelance work goes, Tom, I'd be curious to know, especially before your name became a big name in the map making space, where did you go and how did you go about finding freelance contracts? And how do you recommend people looking for freelance work in this space? Where should they go to do the same?
So it's another one where personal connections are really important. Firing out kind of emails or sending messages on social media to the head of a company or their art director are generally going to get ignored unless you happen to get them right at the time they're looking for someone. Mm-hmm. If you go and meet someone, say at a convention or a local gaming tournament or an event like that, they're much more likely to remember you, but also to, talk to you and take that on. So at the moment, I've been doing a series of freelance projects for Cobalt Press. And that one came out of me going up to the Cobalt Press booth at PAX Unplugged about a year ago and just starting a conversation. We got to talking about maps. I said, oh, by the way, I'm a cartographer. And they just said, oh, great, we need a cartographer. Do you want to do some work for us? If I had, the other situations where similarly, where I just fired off an email trying to do the same thing, you never hear a response.
Yeah.
So, yeah, most of the big freelance projects I've done have come through just talking to people at conventions.
Yeah.
So, I know that's not something everyone can do, but that's still something you can do locally. It doesn't, we're not all trying to work for Wizards of the Coast or Cobalt Press or MCDM. There's plenty of other publishers and just see who's in your local area.
Yeah, that's great advice. I can definitely echo that sentiment about sending an email and then not getting an answer. I mean, not in the context of doing freelance work, but I've been, trying to get somebody to come on my Roleplay Chat podcast, and 9 times out of 10. And I don't fault people for this. 9 times out of 10, they're like, who's this guy? I'm not going to, they don't even bother answering me. So definitely making that connection is important.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think that covers most of the questions that I wanted to ask you, Tom, but it looks like the community here has some that they want to ask you.
Okay, cool.
Let's go down to probably the first one that we got. And this is from TimTim89. And TimTim asks, what advice would you give to increase social media engagement of posts on maps and monsters?
You are generally going to find that engagement on anything that's promotional is going to be low. It's quite hard to boost that. What you want to try and do on social media is have at least as many posts that aren't promotional as are, whether that's just, talking about your day or engaging in conversation on a thread on someone else's, or just, stupid memes. I mean, a lot of the big TTRPG Instagram accounts mostly grew through memes. So if engagement is more important to you, try something that's not a promotional post.
Yeah, I second that. You have to be posting stuff that's not promo material more often than not.
People are so trained to see this as an ad and just scroll on. It's very hard to get away from that.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Let's move on to the next question from Saber Runner. Saber Runner asks, what are your tips for starting and managing a successful Patreon? Do you lean mostly on your architecture training when making maps, or are they additional skills that you've picked up? And okay, I think these are multiple questions. I'm sorry. Let's start with the first one.
Okay.
What are your tips for starting and managing a successful Patreon?
Okay. Tips for starting a Patreon is one I get asked quite a lot. And I think something I try to recommend to everyone is do a dry run. Before you actually launch your Patreon, spend a full month acting as though you had launched it. Create the work, get it ready for the deadline as though you were going to post it. Set up the post, make it a draft post. Maybe you've already got your Patreon page, it's just not gone live yet. Do that for a full month, and that will give you a really good idea of what you can create in a month, where the problem points are that you may not have considered in advance, and also just kind of help get that workflow going. It also means when you do launch, you're a month ahead on content creation because you've just spent a month making stuff. So that stuff can go out the first month while you're making stuff for the second month. The other piece of advice I'd give based on that is you'll get a good idea from that what you can make in a month. Chances are your first month you're going to work flat out. You're going to be at 120% and you can't maintain that. So whatever you can make in that first month, only commit to like 60 to 70% of that going forwards. And if you can keep that up, great. You've got more stuff in the back catalogue, but it's always better to under-promise and over-deliver than the other way around.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I'll make a plug for a chat that we had, it was probably about a year ago now, or close to a year ago now. We had somebody from the Patreon team join us for a chat, and we talked to them about the ins and outs of that. So I would definitely supplement what Tom said with that conversation. You can go listen to it in the kind of the back catalog of the RT Talks.
In terms of a successful Patreon, the only advice I can really give you is be consistent. Consistency ultimately is going to win over most other things. Putting out something incredible, but just disappearing for 3 months at a time is going to pick people off. If people know it's Saturday, I'm getting a Tom Cartos map, I'm going to go get it, and they get that every week for months, years, they're just going to, they're not going to worry. They're just going to think this is just something I pay for, like Netflix, because it's consistent and I know what I'm getting. It's not something I have to think, is this worth my money? Is this worth my time?
Yeah, well said. And yeah, it's a value add, right?
Yeah.
Someone is going to a Patreon to buy something. They're purchasing something. So if you're inconsistent, I agree. It's gone.
It's hard to win someone over, and once you've lost them, you've lost them. It's even harder to get them back.
Yeah, definitely. Saber Runner asks another question about your background, Tom, saying, did you lean mostly on your architecture training when you were making maps, or are there additional skills that you've picked up?
So I'd say the architecture training probably comes into just the sketch phase of what I'm doing, like the design phase, which I think is important. I think it's part of why my maps stand out. But I mean, I've talked about it a lot before. I do not have a background in art. I was not a trained artist. I was not what you might consider a talented artist growing up. At the age of 28, I was working as an architect. I had no drawing or drafting skills whatsoever, and I just decided I wanted my own creative outlet and started learning to draw from YouTube in the evenings. And I got to a point where I felt it was good enough that I could start putting stuff I made online, and ultimately I've just got better at it by doing it every day for 4 or 5 years.
Awesome. That's good advice. Yeah, it's a skill. You got to hone it, definitely.
It is. Anyone can learn to draw.
I'm sure I could, but my drawing skills are terrible.
So I had an Instagram account when I first started learning to draw, which is Tom Cartos as opposed to Tom Cartos. You can go check it out. Scroll back to the first drawing. It's me attempting to draw straight lines and failing. So you can see how bad I was when I started out.
There you go. I might do that. Gives me motivation, perhaps. Appreciate you sharing that, Tom. And then one last question from Saber Runner. What would you recommend to someone who wants to break into the Reddit TTRPG community starting from scratch?
That's a tricky one because Reddit has become very oversaturated and in some cases they don't like self-promotional posts. So a lot of the places where I could consistently post once a week and get 1,000 upvotes almost guaranteed, I now get maybe 10, 15. It's still a good place to post, like I said earlier, because Reddit has a very strong SEO on Google. So when people are searching Google images, most of the stuff that comes up is from Reddit or Pinterest. But in terms of actually getting engagement on Reddit, just post it and forget about it and then do the same thing next week.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just isn't something that exists in the way that it did 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah. I'll admit to, whenever I post things on Reddit, the only things that gets a lot of exposure are the things that tend to generate mean discussions in the comments, right?
Yeah, and that's not what you want, yeah.
No. Yeah, exactly.
It's become more controversial in terms of engagements. And if you look on the D&D subreddit, the only things that get upvotes now are people giving free dice away. So
Yeah. No, Reddit's interesting. I mean, most social media is becoming. You really need to find small niche communities. I feel like otherwise.
yeah, I think we have for a large part passed kind of the peak of what creators can expect in terms of engagement on social media, and all of us are trying to figure out what we do next.
Yeah, well said.
Those platforms are still useful, they're still necessary, but it's certainly changing.
Yeah, a lot less of the creative hive mind that it once was.
Yeah.
We have a couple other questions, Tom, and I just want to make sure we get through all of them. So I'll try to be quick. And for people who've asked more than one question in their comment, I'm going to maybe bounce around to make sure that I get to everybody before coming back. So Dian Demetrius asks, should creating map-adjacent products, specifically for Patreon, like adventure sheets, terrain art, etc., be high on the to-do list of a growing cartographer, or should the focus be more on increasing output and improving maps themselves?
Yeah, focus should always be on the core product. For me, it very much still is. All the extra stuff that I kind of have added to my Patreon over time has been, as I say, added over time, and really only when I had enough excess income that I could hire someone to do it for me. If you're jumping around a lot, that's kind of harming your consistency. If you've gone from creating maps to suddenly creating adventures, people are like, well, this isn't what I signed up for. I don't really know what I'm getting. So yeah, make sure you know what your core brand is. Focus on that. And if you have time for the other stuff, that's great. But the reality is those won't increase your numbers as much as you might think.
Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of answers the next question. But if Tom, if you feel like there's more to add, please do. Canvas Quest asks us, most of us have full-time jobs, families, and other things, and it can be challenging to give time to creating and advertising our content. Do you have a recommendation on where to best spend the 5 to 20 hours we might be able to find? I presume weekly or monthly. And they suggest things like content creation versus map variants versus VTT support, etc. And I think you said it already, focus on your core deliverable, but I'm not sure if there's more to add.
Yeah, focus on your core deliverable, market as much as you reasonably can, because it doesn't matter how good your product is if no one knows about it. That's kind of the secondary focus. Anything else will come in time. All of the adjacent stuff, all of the extras, all the bonus stuff, that will come in time. If you're putting your time into that before you're kind of ready for it, those are hours that are best spent elsewhere.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Snowy Maps asks another question about Patreon. And again, you might have already answered parts of it, so feel free to say so if that's the case. Snowy Maps asks, I've been creating maps for about 1.5 years, and now I've been struggling with the Patreon growth. I'm curious to know what your advice might be like in that area. Like Dean Demetrius, I have also been toying with the idea of making additional supplements to try and continue to grow, or should I just be strictly focusing on my battle maps?
So it's hard for me to answer that specifically because it's going to depend a little bit on, what content you're making and where it's at. But if you've been trying to grow something for a long period of time and it's not working and you're not already at a point where it is successful, you might want to consider trying other things, not necessarily giving up on what you're doing. But like I said, when I started out, I was doing 5 or 6 things. And it took several months before it was very clear that this one thing, which happened to be Patreon, was the one that was, growing. The line was going up the quickest. Mm-hmm. Having said that, my Patreon also hasn't grown in the last 1.5 years. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think we're going through ebbs and flows economically and situationally. These things happen globally. We may find that in the next 6 months to a year, things pick up again, those audiences start to grow again. But ultimately, you kind of have to decide on, is this something I want to continue doing, or do I want to try something else? And it's like we were talking about right at the start. You got to enjoy what you're doing. If you're enjoying doing it and it's making enough money for it to be worth your time, or even if just doing it is enough for you, keep doing it. This doesn't have to become a job. We'd all love for it to.
Yeah.
And I'd love to say it can for everyone. But if you're enjoying what you're doing, you're enjoying the communities you're part of, and the income is enough for you, then just keep doing it.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I have another question for you, Tom. It's from Demille, and it's a bit of a funny one. No one else has asked this question, so Demille felt obliged to do so.
Okay.
Is Cartos your real name? And if it isn't, I'd be curious to know the inspiration behind it.
No, unfortunately, it's not my real name. I wish it was. And the inspiration behind it is actually just a really bad pun, and I feel bad telling it because it's almost not worth it. Like I said earlier, the Instagram account that I started when I started learning to draw is called Tom Cartos, Tom Cartos without the C. That's partly because most names on Instagram were already taken by then, and I couldn't. The first 20 I tried didn't work. But it's just a pun on the British pronunciation of tomatoes. And then when I started apps, it made sense to become Tom Cartos. So sorry.
I love it. That's funny. Sweet. And then I think we have one last question from the community. And this is from Luna, Muddied Water Games. Luna asks, I joined a bit late. Sorry if it's been answered. With Roll20 and DriveThruRPG being the main marketplaces, and the fact that if one fails, the other will too, what other marketplaces would you suggest?
So it depends a little bit on what kind of content you're creating, but there are loads of others out there and more coming. Other places that I'm selling or are looking to sell on. DM's Hub is a VT that has a marketplace. There is Shard VTT, I think, has one. Dungeon Fog has a marketplace for assets. Forge for Foundry, one for Foundry. There are lots out there. And the thing is, you kind of need to post to all of them to make a similar amount of money than you'd make just off Roll20 or DriveThruRPG. They are all smaller, but combined, they can still be valuable. And some of them will help you with ingestion, which is getting your product on there. Others will teach you how to do it. It doesn't take too long. So look out there. But also, if you have digital products or physical products, make your own web store. It'll take you half a day on Squarespace. Those aren't likely to go anywhere.
Yeah, having your own place to refer people to is, I think, it's an important thing.
Yeah.
All right, last one. Nick is talking about, again, the merger between Roll20 and DriveThruRPG. Do you still post to both or just one? Has that changed your posting habits?
I have never posted to DriveThruRPG. I think it is really more for writing and adventures than it is for art. Other artists, particularly cartographers I've spoken to, the kind of revenue from drive-through is less than 5% of what it is on Roll20.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, big difference there.
If you're going to pick one marketplace, Roll20.
Yeah, but like you were saying all along, spread the wealth in case one of them goes away.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Tom. It's been a wonderful time chatting, and you've been doling out all kinds of great advice and recommendations. Before we say our goodbyes, I wanted to give you the floor one last time. If you had any last thoughts or consideration for people here today or people listening into the future with our podcast, as it relates to being an independent content creator. And then once you've given us that, please also remind us where we can find the wonderful maps and products that you create, and if we wanted to know more about where we can sub to your Patreon and things like that.
Sure. Well, yeah, first of all, thanks so much for having me, and thank you for everyone coming to listen. I think the last thing I'd like to say is we talked a lot about how to make success and, how to make money and how to make this your job. But ultimately, your focus should be do something you enjoy. That's largely why a lot of us are in this industry. It's why we're in the hobby. It's because it's a lot of fun. And if you're not doing something you enjoy, whether it makes money or not, you're going to burn out. And burnout doesn't help anyone. So just keep doing what makes you happy. If you want to find my stuff, you can just search Tom Cartos and you'll find me on different platforms.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you, Tom. It's a wonderful discussion, and I highly recommend that everybody here go take a look at Tom's material if you haven't already been familiarized with it, and then give him a follow on the social media platform that you like to doom scroll on. And while you're at it, I'd also encourage you to follow us, the TTRPG Rising Tide, on whatever social media platforms you like to use. That's at TTRPG Rising Tide on Twitter, Tumblr, Mastodon, Blue Sky too, I think. I'm not even sure. There's too many places now. And we'd love it if you shared the good word of the Rising Tide community. The bigger the community grows, the more useful it can be to you. We're a Discord community of content creators for content creators. So we're here to help each other grow and help each other get better. I'm Matt at Roleplay Chat on all socials. Thanks, Tom, for being here. It's been a pleasure. And our next Rising Tide talk is going to be taking place in about a month's time from now. So stay tuned for more details there. And thanks, Tom. And folks, remember that a rising tide lifts all boats. Bye, everyone.